This is Mark Bruzonsky, and welcome to Mideast Realities. We're at the Adass Israel Synagogue in Washington, D.C., and we're listening to Moshe Ahrens. Moshe Ahrens is one of Israel's leading politicians. He's been the defense minister, the foreign minister, the ambassador to the United States, and he represents the Likud party. One of the myths, of course, is that the Likud party and the Labor Party are two very different parties with very different principles and outlooks. The reality of the situation is that the current prime minister and the current foreign minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, have in fact served in Likud governments, with Rabin in fact being the break-their-bones defense minister for Yitzhak Shamir, the last Likud prime minister. Anyway, we've been listening to Moshe Ahrens give his talk. He'll be concluding his talk in the next few minutes, and then he'll be taking questions from a panel of journalists, friendly journalists, and a panel and some questions from the audience. Let's listen in. Indeed, Moshe Ahrens will surely be trying very hard tonight to mask the realities of today's Middle East. So I'll occasionally try to interject a few correctives of my own as we go.
As many of you in the audience probably know, and certainly as everyone in the panel knows, since 1967, that's now, 27 years, every important visitor to Israel was taken up to the Golan Heights in order to be shown, in order that he should see with his own eyes that this was an area that was absolutely essential to Israel's security and that Israel could not give up. And invariably, maybe with very few exceptions, even some high officials of the U.S. administration who made that trip, some refused to make the trip, would say after seeing for themselves, don't give up an inch. This is an area that we really cannot afford to give up. You may have heard that the Israeli foreign minister, now under Mr. Peres' stewardship, has recently given instructions that visitors are not to be taken to the Golan Heights anymore. So on that, I say that's a concession that we should not make. And if the Syrian dictator will not make peace with us unless we do make that concession, I say so be it. The Israeli border with Syria has been a quiet border ever since 1967, and it's been a quiet border because Assad knows how strong Israel is, and that any attempt by him to start a war would lead to his defeat. Not because he has or does not have an agreement, but because he respects, or because he has a certain perception of Israeli strength, which may change for the worse if we lose control over the Golan Heights. The second issue that I think is relatively easy to address, certainly for me, and I think for most Israelis, is the Gaza Strip. I say good riddance to bad rubbish. It's a good thing we're out of there. We don't need it. It's not of great strategic importance to Israel. There are 1 million Palestinians living there in squalor under terrible conditions, a breeding ground for terrorism. It's not a problem that we can solve. If the international community of nations, if the Arab countries that have money like Saudi Arabia realize that this is a problem that needs to be attended to, they should go at it. It's not something that we can handle. And I think that sooner or later, even the present Israeli government will come to the conclusion that they must seal off that area, and that with all the goodwill that we may have to help the economy of the Palestinian population living in Gaza, and the particular interest that Mr. Rabin and Peres have to shore up Yasser Arafat in Gaza by helping him economically, the population of Israel simply will not be prepared to risk the lives of our civilians in the center of our cities or on our buses in order to provide economic assistance to the Palestinian population there. So that presumably is the easy part. Nothing in the Middle East is easy. But as compared to the third element, and I think probably that's the one that you addressed, and that's the future of Judea and Samaria. And that's hard. That's hard. And I would preface whatever I want to say on the subject by something that I think is important to recall and nevertheless frequently forgotten. Not all problems have solutions. As a matter of fact, I think that probably the list of problems in this world that have no solutions is considerably longer than the list of problems that have solutions. Now, that's true in mathematics, but maybe especially true when it comes to human relations and the relations between peoples and the resolution of conflicts. So starting with an assumption that here's a problem, and it is, in this case the problem of the Palestinian population in Judea and Samaria. And all we need to do is to identify that solution. And if we haven't done so, then there's something wrong with us. And if we don't accept some suggestion as being the appropriate solution, then there's something wrong with that. With us, I think, is a basic mistake. There is a almost intractable problem here, in the sense that in Judea and Samaria there are today living 1 million Palestinians. Also, by the way, 140,000 Jews. They represent more than 10% of the population. They travel the roads daily. The children are being bused to school daily. Aside from the 140,000 Israelis who live in the area, hundreds of thousands of Israelis travel through the area for one reason or another. Everybody that travels from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on the main highway passes over the Green Line, whether he knows it or not, or enters the territory of Samaria. Anybody who takes the alternate northern route, which today is a superhighway, just like the main highway, goes 80% of the time through Samaria. And this territory, unlike Gaza, lies right in the heart and guts of Israel. It is essential, in my view, to the very security of Israel. It borders on the population centers of Israel, on Jerusalem, on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. The meaning of this, by the way, is becoming very clear even to the Rabin government, in the sense that they don't seem to be prepared at this time to implement the second step of the Oslo Agreement, namely doing in Judea and Samaria what they did in Gaza, pulling out the Israeli army, or redeploying the Israeli army and turning it over to the PLO police force, in quotation marks. Hardly anybody in Israel is prepared today to envisage the implementation of that, because they're not prepared to envisage the predictable consequences of that happening. So what do you do with a situation where the control over the area is essential to Israel's security? Nevertheless, there are 1 million Palestinians living in the area who are not citizens of Israel, who don't want to be citizens of Israel, and who most Israelis do not want to be citizens of Israel. I have no quick solutions to that. I think it's a problem that needs to be worked, with attention being given to the plight of the Palestinian population, to their aspirations, but in no way neglecting the security needs of the State of Israel. Some indication of the lack of answers in the Paris Rabin camp has come from Mr. Rabin himself these last few weeks. Our Prime Minister, Mr. Rabin, in what seems to me an act of desperation, has begun to talk about separation. Separation between Jews and Arabs. After the Bet Lid incident, an incident in which 21 young Israelis were killed, by the way, an incident that was met by jubilation by masses of people in Gaza, Mr. Rabin appeared on Israeli television and said, what we need is separation, afrada. Separate the Jews from the Arabs. Well, it can't be done. He may have addressed some inner feelings in most Israelis who feel that they would be more secure if Arabs were not walking the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. But we have 800,000 Arabs living in Israel itself who are citizens of the State of Israel. We have 170,000 Arabs living in Jerusalem. Mr. Rabin is obviously not suggesting that Jerusalem be divided between a Jewish Jerusalem and an Arab Jerusalem. However, he said we have 140,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria. Does he want to transfer out Arabs? Does he want to transfer out Jews? I don't think he has seriously addressed the question. I don't think he seriously means to implement it, but it's just an indication of just how difficult the problem is that we're grappling with. So I'm sorry if I'm not giving you a definite solution to this problem. I don't have a definite solution to this problem. As an Israeli, as a former defense minister, I feel I must pay attention first and foremost, not only, but first and foremost, to the security of the State of Israel and the people who live in Israel.
I think the other people on our panel, there's no particular order.
I'd love to just follow up on John's question. And this has to do with, in the interim, I mean, in the near future, if separation isn't the answer, then what do you think should be the modus vivendi between Israelis and Palestinians? For instance, if you were advising Prime Minister Rabin right now, who is going to be Prime Minister for more than another year, I mean, what should he do right now, both in the negotiations itself, the whole Oslo process itself, and in terms of just day-to-day relations between Israel and Palestinians?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I think the Gaza Strip should be sealed
Yes.
off. I know that that's difficult, it's tragic for the population living there, but I really see no other alternative. I think as regards Judea and Samaria, it should not be turned over to the Palestinian police force. I think that would have tragic consequences. I hate to predict the worst, but it's bound to lead to a tremendous increase in terrorism and victims of terrorism, and would probably stall the whole peace process for an extended period of time. So that's a problem that I think simply needs to be worked, and time has to be given to work things out there. And as regards the Golan Heights,
But for instance, you have said that you don't think Yasser Arafat, and certainly has not been elected by the people on the ground. How might an Israeli government engineer the circumstances in which an election could be held when, as I understand it, the Palestinians refuse to hold elections, or the PLO certainly refuses to stand behind any elections as long as the police force is there? I mean, there's this sort of stalemate.
I think that's probably not the real problem, and if the fact that, say, the Israeli army has a presence in the area, and I think if for the moment you ask yourself the question, if elections were held amongst the Palestinian population, under what circumstances would they be free and democratic, or more free and democratic? In the presence of the Israeli army, or would the Israeli army pulled out? I think the answer is incontestable, in the presence of the Israeli army. As a matter of fact, if the area is turned over to Mr. Arafat, I think we can guarantee that these elections will not be free and democratic elections. The Arab world generally doesn't have a tradition of free and democratic elections, and Mr. Arafat certainly has no experience, and I think no desire in carrying out free and democratic elections. So that's not really the obstacle. The obstacle to having free and democratic elections is Mr. Arafat and the Hamas, the fact that there are elements amongst the population, organized elements of the population, who terrorize the population. During the period that I was defense minister, I tried to move the area towards holding elections because, as I pointed out in the peace initiative, which I authored as foreign minister, we wanted to negotiate with the elected representatives. And the problem that I faced in bringing about democratic elections was that people were afraid. People were afraid to be candidates. I would talk to intellectuals. There are lots of bright people with leadership potential amongst the Palestinian population, and I would say to this or that man and woman, would you be ready to be candidate? And he would say, no, I'm afraid my wife won't let me. They're going to kill me. And it is that problem, which is not at all easy to overcome, but it is that problem that has to be overcome in order for elections to be held, which I think are an essential element in moving the peace process forward. Now, any encouragement that's given to the PLO, such as the encouragement that was given by the Bush administration to the PLO at a time when we were trying to move towards elections in the area, of course makes the holding of elections difficult, if not impossible. Because when people in the area, when Palestinians on the ground see that Arafat and his people are getting support from the government of the United States, why should they stick their necks out to run an election?
Likud had its hopes pinned for the longest time on King Hussein. He came through, but too late for Likud. And you, I think, had trouble defining, and maybe you didn't want to define, what these elections would lead to, because on the one hand, you spoke of Israel, I mean the government, the Likud government, spoke of keeping Judea and Samaria. On the other hand, doing something to give Palestinians an expression of autonomy. Having seen what you've seen now, where would those elections lead? Those people are still citizens of Jordan. Do you see some sort of a division on a loan plan? Do you see the Palestinians, just having municipal control, but Israel retaining sovereignty? Can you look down the road a little bit, again, seeing Likud coming back, which doesn't seem impossible? Seeing Likud coming back, and again, you'll be calling for elections, and the question is going to hit you right smack up front. Elections to do what?
The primary point of elections, in my view, was and continues to be electing representatives of the population with whom we can negotiate. And as I said before, if it turns out that the elected representatives do not want to negotiate or do not want peace with Israel, then that, to some extent, will simply be an affirmation of the facts that exist on the ground, that the population is simply not ripe to make an agreement with us.
But you mean peace without statement?
Pardon?
You clearly mean peace without statement.
Well, so now you ask me, what if it turns out that the elected representatives are prepared to sit down and negotiate with us? What would be the final results of those negotiations? I think it would be pretentious of me to try to tell you what that would be. It's far down the road. I've already said, you know, how difficult the situation is that we're facing. I think it would have to move, first of all, in the directions of municipal leadership and municipally elected officials who would run the large cities, large Palestinian cities in the area, like Nablus, like Tulkarem, like Al-Kilya, and then we would have to see where we go from there.
But a very quick one, but Mr. Rabin has 20 months left. Where is he, at least? Where is, unless maybe Labor will win, but he has certainly 20 months left. Where is he going with this Palestinian representation?
Barry, first of all, as you know, we have a parliamentary system in Israel, so it is not clear that he has 20 months left, because we might have early elections. And I didn't mean that facetiously. I didn't mean that facetiously. The feeling in Israel today is that the government is standing on very weak legs. And I point out again something that maybe some of you are not aware of. I said before that the Rabin government had a one-vote majority as a result of the elections, right? 61 members of Knesset who supported them out of 120. Now that majority, that 61 vote majority that they had, included 5 members of the Communist Party, 3 members of the Communist Party, and 2 that belong to Mr. Daraush's party, which are open backers of the PLO. Parties in the past were not considered potential coalition partners. Whether it is at all proper, reasonable, politically correct and legitimate for a government with so narrow a majority, and not a majority amongst the Jewish population of Israel, to take such far-reaching measures to which at least 50%, and today more than 50% of the population is opposed, I think is a very valid question, and my answer to that question is clear. They do not have a moral mandate for what they're doing, even though Rabin continues to insist that as long as he has that 61 vote majority, he will continue to do what he considers to be right for the state of Israel. At the moment, it is not at all clear that he will be able to maintain that 61 vote majority. Some members of the Labour Party are beginning to buck. On the Golan Heights issue, some people have declared openly that they will not provide support, in which case the elections will be held earlier.
May I ask perhaps one final question along these lines? You said that given the atmosphere of terrorism and intimidation that exists right now in the territories, it's not possible to proceed with implementation of the Oslo Accords. Personally, I would agree with you. If you take into account the security and safety of the Israeli population. But at the same time, you've also noted that you've got 1 million Arabs, 1 million Palestinians in that area, and you have also acknowledged that you can't really seal them off. Oh, and don't you therefore have what is really a pressure cooker situation building up towards an explosion of some kind that far eclipse the Intifada and what has come before?
Well, first of all, the Middle East is a pressure cooker. Has been and is, and I dare say will continue to be, because of the very unwieldy demographic and cultural structure that characterizes the Middle East. But I would like to be specific in addressing your question, John. The great disappointment, I think, to the world at large, to Israelis generally, to Israelis who supported the Oslo agreements particularly, is the fact that the Oslo agreements were followed by a tremendous upsurge in the rate of terrorism and the casualties. Now, most people, even many that opposed the Oslo agreements, thought that the opposite would be the case, that the Oslo agreements might remove some of the incentive, some of the catalysts, for terrorist activity, and it turned out that the opposite was the case. You may recall that Mr. Rabin on the White House lawn, in that famous or maybe infamous handshake with Yasser Arafat, said, "This spells the end of bereavement, the end of Israeli mothers having to mourn the death of their sons." Well, just the opposite turned out to be the case. Now, what's the reason for that? And I would say in very concrete terms, I don't presume to know all of the answers to that terrible development, but in very concrete terms, the Israeli army moving out of Gaza, in effect, brought about, in large measure, if not totally, the loss of intelligence that was available to us on the organization of terrorist activities in the past. When the Israeli army was in Gaza, the Israeli security services were in Gaza, they had lots of contacts in the Palestinian population. They had a fairly large number of Palestinians who assisted the Israeli security services, who have been called pejoratively collaborators in quotation marks. In Gaza, all that's gone. All that's gone, not there anymore. If the Gaza Strip was sealed off, you might say it doesn't matter. But the Gaza Strip is open. And it's in the Gaza Strip that these terrorist attacks, at least the recent ones, have been engineered, and the people have been recruited and trained and sent out to do the suicide bombing. I think that is probably the major reason for the upsurge in terrorism. We've lost the control, the degree of control that we had. We didn't have 100% control, but the degree of control that we had, or a large part of the degree of control that we've lost. And this is the reason why even supporters of the Oslo Agreement, I think including Mr. Rabin today, don't dare to envisage doing the same thing in Judea and Samaria. Because if now in areas bordering on the municipal boundaries of Israel's major cities, we were to lose that same kind of control and lose all access to intelligence that might give us advance warning of organization of terrorist activities, then we hate to imagine what the results are likely to be.
Do you think that Yasser Arafat's failure to fill the gap here and prevent this kind of terrorism, do you think it's a failure of ability, lack of ability, or a lack of will? And is it that he really doesn't want to, or that he's just incapable of it?
I think it's probably a good measure of both. I think on the one hand, he's not eager to do it. He wants to play the role of the leader, in quotation marks, of the Palestinian population as a whole, whether they are devout Muslims or not such devout Muslims, whether they're fundamentalists or whether they are secular Palestinians. He wants to be their leader, and so he doesn't want to get into confrontation with the Orthodox Muslim population. And secondly, I think it has now become clear to everybody that he is not a great administrator. He's not a great doer.
Will you serve in another Likud government, and would you consider running for prime minister?
I believe in service. I don't believe in servitude. I didn't believe I deserve a life sentence. I think 18 years in the political arena in Israel, which is pretty tough. Of course, it's been a great privilege, but I think that's enough. I'm on my 7th career now.
Mr. Ahrens, this is not a question. I rise because there's a synagogue in which I grew up, and I observe the outside here twice a year. And I'm shocked by one of your remarks referring to the people who live on the Gaza Strip. You said good riddance to bad rubbish. That statement implies a sense of superiority on the part of Israeli Jews vis-a-vis Gaza Arabs. These are people who've lived in that area ever since the war, who've lived in poverty, who are very essentially lumped as victims, as refugees. And sir, for you to refer to these people as rubbish, I think is highly offensive.
Well, we had a procedure for asking questions at any round. I'll certainly give.
Well, that's okay. I'll respond. And I'm sorry if my remark was misinterpreted. I certainly didn't mean the people living in the area, and I'm fully aware of the tremendous tragedy that represents the million population in Gaza. I've visited Gaza umpteenth time as defense minister. I used to go down there at least twice a week. Did whatever I could to alleviate the situation, which in the final analysis was really very little. What I meant was that it's a big burden on Israel, and it's something that we cannot handle. It's much too big on us. And so as far as we're concerned, it's best to be rid of it and let those countries that have the wherewithal and that really have an obligation to assist these refugees, let them do the job. If we can assist in some manner, we will. I know that Mr. Peres is going around the world trying to collect funds for the Palestinians. I don't think he's going to be successful. I don't think that can solve the problem. But I didn't mean it in the pejorative sense that you thought I did.
Well, you may not have, but the word rubbish is not the same idea.
I think you made the point.
This is Mark Bruzonsky, your host for Mideast Realities. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please tune in next week on this channel, same day of the week, same time, for another Mideast Realities.